I'd like to talk to you a little bit tonight about some of the main topics from the book, Waking the Sleeping Giant. In particular, that's always an anxious moment. In particular, I'd like to answer two questions. How does the left-wing minority wield such power in this country? And secondly, what do conservatives need to do differently? Because I think we need to face the fact that we're, as a conservative movement, we're a little bit like the guy that moved to a small southern town, and word got out that he was a bagpipe player for his hobby, and there was not much interest in that until one day a minister called and said that a homeless person had been passing through town and unfortunately had died while he was in the town. And they didn't know what to do. There was no identification, there was no information. And one of the local churches had volunteered to donate a grave plot. And so they said, you know, we're going to do a free burial for the guy. Would you mind coming and at least playing the bagpipes? I mean, he has no family, nobody. So the guy said, sure, and he drove out in the country. And of course, as he drove out in the country, it was winding roads, and next thing he knew, he was kind of turned around. And it wasn't too long before he realized he was probably lost. Finally got turned around, got on the right road, drove up to the church, and sure enough, his nightmare came true. It looked like everything was over. There were just a couple of guys standing there with shovels next to the hole, and they had already started filling in the hole. He thought, I've missed this poor man's funeral. So he walked up to it, he said, you know, I don't know what else to do. I feel like I owe it to the poor guy. So he pulled out the bagpipes and did the most amazing version of Amazing Grace. It was heart-rending. The guys with the shovels stood up and started crying. It was just a very touching moment. And so when he finally finished, he had done the best he could for the guy. The echo kind of melted away in the woods around the church, and he kind of solemnly walked back to his car, and he heard one of the workmen say, "That's the most amazing thing I've ever seen." And the other guy said, "Yeah, me too, and I've been putting in septic tanks for 20 years." I think conservatives do a very good performance. We can put out a beautiful song, but I'm afraid we're doing it in the wrong places sometimes. We need to talk about that. Let's look at the first question. How does the liberal minority wield such power? Because there's a question we need to face here, and that is conservatives really should be doing a lot better in this country. 40% of us identify ourselves as conservative, 20% as liberal, and that's Democrats and Republicans kind of all through that mix. But along the middle, you've got 40% that really don't identify themselves one way or the other. Ladies and gentlemen, if we were just to split the middle with the left, we would end up with 60-40 majority in everything. So somehow the left-wing minority is doing a much better job of reaching those folks who don't have a defined political philosophy. And so we should be winning easily, but we're not. Let's talk about why. I know some of you have just finished eating, and I hate to put this up and ruin your dinner, but I think there's two symbols that kind of tell the story here. The first is the campaign slogan for the Obama campaign, Forward. Now, what comes to mind when you think of forward? That suggests that there's an agenda, that there's a direction, there's a destination, there's a plan to get there. It's an aggressive kind of symbol. It's saying we are going somewhere, we're coming after you. Think about the Tea Party's main symbol. The most popular symbol is the Don't Tread on Me flag. Well, what does that connote? It basically says, I will protect my turf, but I'm not going anywhere. So when you combine those two, you've got these guys saying, we're coming for you, and these guys saying, don't you come over here, but already mentally, who is on the defensive? The nature of conservatism is it is a defensive political philosophy, and that's the first thing we've got to face. That's not working for us, because they eventually wear us down, and that's what they've been doing with the country. The left has learned to use our worldview and our character against us. Most Americans subscribe to a Judeo-Christian worldview. There are differences, of course. I'm not even talking about religion here. I'm talking about a cultural worldview that says there is such a thing as reality, there's such a thing as truth, and a major tenet of that is that we are morally responsible to take care of ourselves. We're morally responsible for what we do. We can't blame other people. We have to be responsible for ourselves. And what that leads us to is a live and let live mentality. The average conservative basically is saying, my contract with you is I won't get in your stuff, don't you get in my stuff, and we'll cooperate voluntarily when that's in our mutual interest. But what I won't do is tell you how to live your life. The hardcore left, and again, I'm not talking about your student who comes home from school and spouts the latest liberal dogma they've heard. I'm talking about the hardcore Alinskyite left. Comes from a moral worldview that is about moral relativism. That you've got your truth, I've got my truth, there are different truths for different people. When I hear that, I always like to test the waters a little bit and say, well, my truth is that you're an idiot. Now, I don't actually say that. I'm tempted to say that. But it just kind of shows that relativism falls apart when you think about it. But out of that relativism, we also see another major trend in our culture, and that is that there's a whole segment of our society that has a blame and entitlement attitude. If they don't get something they want, it's your fault. If they have an itch, it's your obligation to scratch it. It's just a sense of entitlement. I have a friend who is in Georgetown at this point, and he was furious when Sandra Fluck came out with that thing about, you know, I deserve free contraceptives. He said, do you have any idea what it costs to go to this school? She's in this school, she can afford to go here, and yet she thinks taxpayers should have to subsidize her contraceptives. That sense of entitlement. And here's the scary one. There is a major subset of the hardcore left that has an insatiable need for control, the need to manipulate other people, the need to meddle in other people's business, and the need to push their agenda. What we as conservatives have to face is when you've got people whose basic philosophy is live and let live, living in the same community with people whose philosophy is I will tell you what you can have and what you can do. How is that going to come out? How's that going to come out? They're going to be on offense, they're going to be pushing, they're going to be pushing, they're going to be pushing, and eventually we're going to give in. Eventually we lose ground. So automatically we're on defensive. In the book, we make the argument that the left has learned to use our maturity and our decency against us. And so that's one of the things that we need to talk about tonight. Prime rule of politics is that a minority willing to push an agenda will always dominate a minority that just wants to be left alone. We've seen it all through our lives. How many of you have ever seen a 4-year-old dominate two grown-up parents? Because the 4-year-old knows something. The 4-year-old knows that those parents just want to get out of the store without a scene. And once the 4-year-old knows that, who's got the power in that relationship? If the parents are tired, the parents have been working all day, the parents just don't have it in them to fight anymore, the child has the power in that relationship. And we've seen it with the schoolyard bully, we've seen it with the irate coworker, we've seen countless times where the squeaky wheel gets the grease. Ladies and gentlemen, the squeak in our culture comes from the radical left, not from mainstream, hardworking, conservative Americans. When it comes to politics, we are unfortunately the summer tourists of American politics. For conservatives, politics is basically seasonal. It's like vacation. So there's this weird season when there's commercials and there's bumper stickers and there's campaigns, and we kind of visit that season. It's like going on vacation. But what do we do when that season's over and we voted like good citizens? We go home. We go back home. What does the left do? The left stays behind. Liberals are the locals of politics. Liberals live in politics. They live for politics because politics is all about power. We think in terms of civics. The left thinks in terms of politics. Civics is about what should happen. Politics is about what's going to happen. And the waking the sleeping giant is about the idea that mainstream, center-right Americans need to wake up to that and realize we're losing our country. And so here's what we've got to do to take it back. First thing we've got to do is realize and I'm not going to cover all the tactics tonight. We talk about 7 tactics in the book. I'm actually going to talk about 2. But one I think is central, and it's the left has used the tactic of riding the appeasement cycle. I actually spoke to the U.S. House Whip team a couple of months ago, 70 members of Congress, and they told me when Boehner got there, you got to wrap it up in about 5 minutes because Boehner's going to be here to talk to his troops. So Boehner came in just as this slide came up. I got a very cold handshake afterwards. Mainstream Americans want to live in harmony, we want to mind our own business. The radical left has an extreme desire for power, the need to manipulate and run our business. When they don't get their way, what do? They scream, they pressure, they demand, they cajole, they call us names. And at first we debate, we resist, we say, well, we can't afford that, or that's not in the Constitution. Eventually, like the tired parents who just want to get home, what do? We give in, and then the cycle repeats. That's when I got the cold handshake from Speaker Boehner. This nation didn't get a $16 trillion debt overnight. This nation got a $16 trillion debt through thousands of repetition of this appeasement cycle, most of which were too small to even end up in the newspapers. I hate to say it, but conservatives really don't have a political strategy. And when you think about it, it makes sense, because conservatism isn't the kind of belief system that is going to have a strategy. A strategy is about where you're going. Well, where we're going is to mind our own business. And I like to say, minding your own business is not a political strategy. One of the things to keep in mind is that we have had an electoral strategy. While conservatives have been focused on winning the next election, the left has had a strategy for winning the next generation. And that's one of the things that we've got to realize, because that's why we're in such trouble. The liberal strategy is to play offense and be on offense, and I'm going to give you 3 examples of that. One is that they control the agenda. Most of the agenda in this country comes from the left. It doesn't matter that they're a small minority. Secondly, their major strategy is to control the cultural institutions, because the cultural institutions control the political narrative. I did a major article for Breitbart just a few weeks ago, and the question I asked at the very beginning is, at your next conservative gathering, ask people to tell you in a short phrase what the conservative strategy is for turning this country back around. And my bet was, you won't get an answer. We don't have a strategy. The left can give you their strategy in an elevator ride, a proverbial elevator speech. Control the institutions and you control the narrative. For example, short list of liberal initiatives. Just look down that. I had somebody the other night, I like your point about it, this is nonpartisan, because I had a ringer at a talk I did the other night. The guy stood up and said, well, George Bush did bailouts, and I said, it reads liberal and conservative, not Democrat and Republican. Okay? But just look, there's their short list. Now somebody name a conservative initiative. Somewhere where we have the left backing up, scared, afraid of losing their ground. Where do we have the left backing up and on the defensive? You know, I will occasionally hear tax cuts as an answer to that. Ladies and gentlemen, if you've got 2 cars and a thief takes one of them, you haven't gained the car. Okay? Keeping more of what was yours is not a strategy. About the only time we catch them is when they don't pay their taxes.
Well, gun control. They're
defensive again.
They're kind of on the defensive right now. I think it's kind of turned a little bit.
Well, that one may have turned, but who has had the momentum? Why do we even have an NRA? Why do we have to fight so hard to maintain our rights? It's because the left is constantly coming after our guns. We're winning this one right now, I think, but I think we're still winning it from a defensive position, because what we're trying to do is keep our Second Amendment rights. We're not requiring them to take an Eddie Eagle gun safety course, okay? So, I'm not saying that we don't ever win one or that we don't ever do anything that are good. I'm just saying, if you really look at the major political agenda in this country, it comes from the left. Our strategy is to say, whoa there, you can't afford that. That's not in the Constitution, you can't do that. So that's one of the major things we've got to change. I always like to show this when I have a few more minutes, because this sounds so conspiratorial when I talk about the Frankfurt School and revolution as the long cultural march. Because it sounds like people sneaking around in dark alleys with overcoats on, with secret handshakes and passwords. It's not. Look at the faces on these guys. These are people from the Frankfurt School, radical left-wing Marxists from the 1930s and beyond on into the 50s and some into the 60s. And they were college professors. They were Marxists, and they realized after World War I, classical Marxist theory said that the workers of the world would unite and take over the means of production. That was the theory, violent revolution. These Marxists could not believe when World War I happened and British soldiers fought to defend Britain. French soldiers fought to defend France. They couldn't believe that the soldiers didn't turn on their own officers. The proletariat was supposed to turn against the bourgeoisie. So classical Marxist theory went out the window, And these guys began to say we need a new cultural Marxism. This guy, Antonio Gramsci, is the one who came up with the phrase, the long march through the cultural institutions. The theory was that the Judeo-Christian worldview was the major impediment to statism. Why? Because of its emphasis on personal responsibility. There actually were three targets of this cultural movement. Number one was Judeo-Christian religion. Number two was the traditional family. Number three was national boundaries, national borders. So how are we doing on those three so far? I wanted to show you these guys in particular. How many of you have heard the old mantra that conservatives are close to Nazis? That they were all right-wing, we're all that conservatives are just a moment away from turning Nazi. You see that innocent-looking grandfatherly face right there? Theodore Adorno, author of the book, or co-author of the book, The Authoritarian Personality. It was all the rage on college campuses in the 1950s. That is where that theory came from. It was kind of a mix of Freudian philosophy that said that we're all repressed, we have domineering fathers, and so we approve of domineering father figures in politics like Adolf Hitler. Now, the funny thing is that the left has pushed this idea for a long time, but in reality, if you want to get nasty about it, who's closest to fascist on a college campus? The conservatives who will listen to other points of view, or the liberals who will shout down anybody who disagrees with them? It's the one on the left. So, I just wanted to show you that to make the point. This was not some kind of conspiracy, okay? This was a movement. It was out in the open. It happened under our noses. And here's what happened. These guys realized after they left Europe and came to the Northeast, particularly Columbia, Brandeis, some other places, but the Northeastern universities, they realized that the long, slow cultural change was the path to statism. Remove the Judeo-Christian boundaries and the culture will just slide into socialism. Guess what their first target was? The schools of education. Now, why would that be? Now, I always am so careful when I say this because somebody always says, are you telling me that my kid's teacher is a communist? And I'm saying, no. But I am saying that your kid's teacher was taught by somebody who was taught by somebody who was taught by somebody who read books written by communists. I'm not saying every one of them, and there are a lot of conservative teachers in the schools, but I'm saying that these were early targets and that the realization was if we get the kids early enough. And here's the strategy. The strategy is immersion, not conversion. We need to understand that. Conversion is you get theory A and theory B, you weigh the evidence between the two and you decide which you believe. Immersion is you only get theory A and you never know there's a theory B. Our kids grow up in schools where they're taught that Franklin Roosevelt stopped the Great Depression with a massive spending program. They never hear that there were other depressions when the president didn't do anything and the recovery happened in about a year. They never understood that all the spending programs delayed the recovery from the Great Depression for about 10 years. But the strategy was brilliant because it spreads throughout into our culture through immersion, not conversion. One of the CEOs that I coach in my other business, I was having lunch with him the other day, or it was actually after the election, and he was just livid. He was furious because he said, Tim, I have raised my daughter right, I've taught her the right values. He said, and she has lived in the benefit of a free enterprise society. I'm a CEO of a company, I've led a successful company, I've made good money. She's reaped the benefits of that. She's gone to the best schools, she's had all kinds of benefits. She's now studying art in France on my dime. And he said, and the twerp emailed me and said she voted for Obama. Now, how many times have you heard that? How many times have you heard conservatives complain we send our kids to school and they come back spouting liberal dogma? How many times have you heard that? How many times have you heard a liberal say, you know, I sent my kid to this expensive college and they came back, looked me in the eye, and said, show me in the Constitution where the federal government has the authority to take over my health care. Not only that, they walk around the house spouting Milton Friedman and saying people ought to buy their own darn contraceptives. I've never heard a liberal complain that their kid went off to school and came back a conservative. Ladies and gentlemen, do you see what our problem is here? The The left realized that political power is like an iceberg. We concentrate on winning the government. That's why I say we have an electoral strategy. The left has a cultural strategy because they realize that formal power rests on the culture. The institutions are the bridge. The educational institutions, the news media, entertainment in particular, because they control the political narrative. I'm going to tell you in a moment what I mean by the political narrative. But here's the thing we've got to face. Even when conservatives win elections, the people who lost the election teach our children the next day, and they report the news the next day. So how long can we hold out as long as that's the case? You see where I'm heading, ladies and gentlemen? What do we have to do?
Take it back.
What do we have to do is take it back, and that's going to take a long time. We don't normally think long term. The second thing we've got to do is buy some time in the meantime, because we've lost so much ground already. We have to have a cultural strategy. We have to change the way we approach politics. How many of you have read I, Pencil by Leonard Read? Oh, thank you. It's a great read. It's a wonderful little monograph about how the miracle of free enterprise produces something as simple as a pencil.
Super short, too.
And it's short, it's something, you know, I read that and I thought, wouldn't it be neat if every school kid in America read that? And then my heart sank, because I thought, you know, that's not going to happen. That's not going to happen. In the United States of America, there's no way that we have a plan to make sure that our children read that, unless we give it to them ourselves. I read Basic Economics again recently by Thomas Sowell. Powerful book, written appropriately for a high school level. Why shouldn't every high school student in this country read a book about the power of free enterprise? It demolishes all kinds of myths about socialism, taxation. It's a wonderful book and it's very readable. And then once again I thought, but there's no way that's going to happen. Why not? Because the left controls the schools. That's not going to be taught in our tax-funded schools. Let me show you what is taught in our tax-funded schools. I'm not saying this is in every school, there are exceptions, but this was from an 8th grade science class. The assignment was, ladies and gentlemen, or students, you've got 100 people and you've got $100, and your assignment, this was an 8th grade science class, one person has $40, 99 have $60, so how much do each of these 99 people get? That was the assignment. Where have you seen those numbers before? 1 and 99, 1% and 99%. It's an Occupy Wall Street. And then the article went on to say, and the students loved it, they got excited, they started shouting out, a penny, a nickel, a quarter. I got ticked off just at that point because I thought, wait a minute, this is an 8th grade science class, math is the language of science. You're telling me that you've got close to 100 people dividing up $60. It's going to come out somewhere close to 60 cents. Did any of the kids guess 60 cents? That was enough to tick me off. But what's the real message there?
It's not fair.
The message is it's not fair. What got left out? How this person made that money. How many of these people will one day be over here? How many of these people are here because they made bad choices? None of that is covered. What's covered, and what they don't cover is how many sleepless nights this person had when they started out a company, or people that I know who started out living in a house trailer, borrowed money, started a company, they're in the office at 5 o'clock in the morning, they've gone without paychecks in order to meet payroll. By the way, if you're an entrepreneur, you know what I'm talking about. If you run a small business, you know what it's like to go without a paycheck in order to meet a payroll. That wasn't covered in the class. So what was the message? The distribution of wealth in this country is unfair. That's what I mean by the narrative. The narrative is what gets discussed and what gets left out. So much of media bias is not just what they cover, it's what they don't talk about. Also the assumptions, the unstated assumptions. One of the techniques we teach in the book is listen for unstated assumptions. I got a caller on a radio show the other day who said, all right, government can buy medicine cheaper than you can, right? And I said, well, of course, government can buy medicine in bulk. He said, well, then fine, why shouldn't government provide your medication? Government can do it cheaper. So listen to his unstated assumption. If government can do it, government should do it. If you say A, you must say B. My response to him, by the way, was, well, by the way, government can buy firearms cheaper than I can, right? He said, yep. I said, well, then why shouldn't government provide my firearms? And they said, I don't want to provide your firearms. And I said, I don't want to provide your medicine. But from there we get our conclusions. And this is what I mean by the narrative. It's what is discussed, it's the assumptions that are embedded in it, and the inevitable conclusions. We're going to talk more about how to turn that against the left in a few minutes. Give you just a couple of quick examples. How many of you remember the debate, the Republican debate, when George Stephanopoulos asked Mitt Romney if he believed that the Constitution granted a right to privacy, or could states outlaw contraception? Remember that?
Yeah.
Question right out of the blue. I sat there watching it, my head turned around like that girl in The Exorcist, because I knew what was coming. He was trying to trap Romney into talking about Griswold versus Connecticut, which was the classic case. It's a case nobody much cares about anymore, but it had to do with the state of Connecticut trying to outlaw contraception, and the argument about whether the states could do things that the federal government couldn't do. The average American would have dozed off if Romney had talked about that, but what would the headline have been next day? The headline would have been, Romney says that we can outlaw contraception. Now, how many liberals do you know who truly believe in privacy? If you mean the privacy to choose your own health care, to decide about privacy when you're voting on a union, about privacy in owning firearms. How many of you remember the story that came out of North Carolina, down close to where I live? A kid, a federal worker in a school, looked inside a kid's lunchbox, decided that it didn't meet standard, and made the kid buy a different lunch. So we've got federal workers now monitoring your kid's lunchbox. Catholic Church could tell you a few things about privacy. So this is what I mean by framing, and it's an important concept. How did this argument get framed in this country? Did we talk about these things?
No.
Well, we talked about those things. The way we mean framing is literally like cropping a picture. It's what gets included and what gets left out. And so for the next month after that, it was very obvious that Stephanopoulos was coordinating with the White House, because for the next month after that, a nation with a $16 trillion debt actually talked about whether we should be providing free contraceptives. So that's the power of the institutions to frame what gets discussed and what doesn't. One more example. How many of you heard about fair share? But you're not paying your fair share. 70% of the taxes in this country are paid by 10% of the population, and we're not paying our fair share. 100% of the taxes are paid by 50% of the population. We're not paying our fair share, according to the left. This is the way it gets framed. How much do you hear about rich versus poor, the rich and the poor? They make it sound like there's two different groups, don't they? Don't you kind of picture some little homeless waif over here and then a fat cat over here with a cigar, lighting the cigar with a $100 bill? That's the narrative. That's the way the story plays out. We hear about redistributing wealth and the greedy rich. What we don't hear about is the fact that rich and poor are different people, are the same people at different stages of life. How many of you have more now than you did when you were a teenager? How many of you hope to have more 20 years from now? Because you work, you save. Most of us started out without owning a house. We didn't own a car. We were on a ramen noodle every night budget, as the announcer says on television. Thomas Sowell, in his book, demolishes the idea that rich and poor are two different categories of people. They're the same people moving through different stages of life. We don't teach that in this country. Most wealth is earned by hard work and good habits. If you do a short list of things, such as don't use drugs, stay in school, get a job, and don't have babies until you get married, you're extremely unlikely to be in poverty. And yet we don't talk about that, but we do talk about the rich versus the poor. How many of you have heard that when countries like India and China move toward a more free enterprise economy, that the poor, the gap between rich and poor actually gets worse? How many of you have heard that? Well, guess what? It does. What they don't tell you is that the poor do better than they do under a state-controlled economy. So what they're zeroing in on is the fact that the rich do better, but the poor do better as well. Now, once again, we've got a choice of how to frame that argument when we talk about this in this country. How do you suppose this gets framed in our news media, in our schools, and even in the entertainment industry? That's the way that one gets framed. The technique we're talking about is seizing control of the narrative, and it literally means moving the frame of the picture so that we show a different picture to that 40% who are in the middle who haven't made up their minds yet. One other tactic I want to cover, and then I want to cover some fun methods, and then we'll move on to the closure. But we need to remember that the hardcore left uses words for effect. If your college student comes home from school and says, you know, I'm concerned that a certain policy is racist, they probably mean that they're concerned that it's racist, okay? And you would share that same concern. Now, you may not agree that the policy is racist, but you taught them that racism is wrong, and they believe that, and they're concerned about it. I'm not talking about your college student that comes home. I'm talking about the hardcore left who uses words like bricks. They throw them at you in order to get you to back down and get you off your topic. The point here is when we debate the left on the left's terms, we've already lost. Let me tell you a little bit about carrot and stick words. Liberals use words for effect. Now, they can talk all day long about diversity. What do when they see something they don't like? They try to shut it down or outlaw it, okay? You seen that email that went around about when a conservative doesn't like a radio show, they don't listen to it. When a liberal doesn't like it, they shut it down. If a conservative doesn't want a gun, they don't buy one. If a liberal doesn't like one, they try to keep you from buying one. I mean, it's a popular email, but it shows that all this is just kind of happy talk. How many of you have run into some of these? That you've ever been called racist, sexist, hater, greedy, McCarthyite? If you haven't been called a McCarthyite, you're not getting close to home, okay? Let me tell you about my favorite liberal, Jimmy Carter. Jimmy Carter was the man who got me active in conservative politics. Because he said something on television one time, my head turned around about 3 times like the girl in The Exorcist, and I picked up the phone, called headquarters and said, I'll lick stamps, I'll do whatever I can do to help out, we got to do something. Do you remember when Jimmy Carter said it was racist to oppose Obamacare? Remember that?
Yes.
Now, let me give you an imaginary conversation with Jimmy Carter on his terms. Hold on there, Jimmy. I actually opposed Hillary care also, and Hillary's white. Jimmy think for a minute and he'd go, well, you know why? The reason is because you're sexist. See, you're a racist because you oppose Obamacare. You're a sexist because you oppose Hillary care. I said, wait a minute, Jimmy. Condoleezza Rice is a black female, and y'all talk about her like she was a dog. Does that mean you're racist and sexist? Jimmy would think for a minute and say, you know what you are? You a hater. You are a greedy hater. That's who you are. You're a greedy hater. Have you ever given a liberal facts and have them turn around and say, well, you know, you're right, I haven't thought about that. Well, you guys are racist. Wait a minute, I sent money to Alan West. Have you ever had a liberal go, oh, I guess that kind of disproves my point, doesn't it? They don't do that. They just call you another name. You know what all that really means in liberal? It just means you're not making me happy and I hate you. You can't debate that. You can't debate that. And again, I'm talking about the hardcore. So we got to understand communication's happening at 2 levels. There's always the surface level. In my old clinical days, if the patient came in and said, I'm feeling much better than I was last week, then I would note what the patient said, that he was feeling better, but I would also note that underneath you could tell he wasn't. So sometimes there's 2 levels of communication. You got a young man and a young lady working out together in the gymnasium. He checks out her finger and sees there's no ring on it, so he comes out with, do you come here often? Now, anybody who's been around the block a couple of times knows what's going on there, right? What's really going on there? Is he doing marketing research for the gym? He doesn't care what her answer is. He could have asked her anything because he's really saying, you're kind of cute and I'd like to date you. And anybody who's been in the world for a while could hear her answer and she could say, I come in here twice a week. And they could pick up on whether that meant come on over and talk to me or stay over there, okay? It's all in the tone. Now, what's the significance of that for politics? Next time you see a liberal and a conservative on television, on one of those talk shows, notice who's always interrupting the other one. Notice which one stops talking when they get interrupted. Notice which one is always making an accusation, a demand, and which one is always defensive. It doesn't matter what the surface issue is. Usually what's happening is the left is saying at that deeper level, you're bad because, and we're usually saying, no, I'm not, because. When you get caught in that pattern, you have already lost the debate. It doesn't matter how good your points are, because anybody watching that is going to see that you're on defense. That 40% in the middle who just wants to know who's right is going to see us on the defensive, and they say, well, why, you spend a lot of time trying to convince me that you don't hate poor people. There must be something there. So what do we need to do differently? We've got to change the way we think about politics. I think the first thing we've got to do is seize offense and start controlling the political narrative. Ladies and gentlemen, we've been defending liberty long enough. It's time to start making the left defend socialism. We've got to realize that politics is year-round and it's generational. For the left, everything is political. We think of politics as having to do with election cycles. From now on, we've got to realize, like my unfortunate CEO friend, I shouldn't say unfortunate, somebody with that amount of money, but anyway, my CEO friend with a daughter who's studying art in France on his dime, we've got to realize that a conversation over your dinner table is political. We've got to realize that when you're looking at your third grader, you're looking at a future voter who's already being immersed in liberal dogma in the schools. You've got to realize when you're talking to your neighbor across the backyard fence, when you're having a cookout, that there are opportunities for us to engage in political dialogue that bypass the liberal media and the liberal institutions. We, as grassroots America, have to develop a cultural strategy that isolates the hardcore, in other words, expose them, but educate the uninformed and misinformed. We don't have time to get into it tonight, but a major point there is we have to use different tactics with different groups. The hardcore, I just want to shut them down. I frankly just want to hit them so hard it'll make their children be born dizzy. So when a liberal makes some kind of snarky comment and they're a hardcore liberal, I want to come back with something that is going to shut them down. What I don't want to do is use the same tactic with my neighbor who genuinely is concerned about fairness in the tax system. I want to engage them and be able to discuss with them, because a lot of them are, what I mean by the uninformed and the misinformed is they have simply fallen for the rhetoric. How many of you know hardworking, decent people, maybe they go to church, they seem decent, and they vote for the other side. They vote for the hardcore left. But they vote for them not because they're trying to destroy America, but because they genuinely believe that the left is helping the poor. Or they genuinely believe that liberals believe in education. They genuinely believe that. We can work with those people. What we can't do is get angry, get frustrated, and get in their face, because we're going to shut them down. These guys, don't worry about hurting their feelings, okay? Just quiet them down and get them out of the way. We've got to mobilize the grassroots, and here's one of the hardest things we've got to face. Conservatives fight among ourselves. We'll form a circular firing squad on a moment's notice over libertarian versus social conservative, over economic conservative, over free trade versus economic nationalism. Now, why is that? Conservatism is actually a diverse movement. The way I've been describing it lately is liberals have one thing in common. They're like people standing in line at a vending machine, and government's the vending machine. They don't have to have anything in common with the other people standing in line at the vending machine, do they? So, because they just have that one goal, to get what they want out of the vending machine. We're basically the people who are stocking the vending machine. We've got a lot of interest in what the other people are doing, okay? So we'll argue among ourselves. This phrase actually comes from a phrase that one of the earlier gentlemen I showed you, Herbert Marcuse, had a phrase in French, because the Marxists were arguing with the Leninists, the social democrats were arguing with the liberals. It just went on and on and on. And so he said in French, pas d'ennemis à gauche, there are no enemies on the left. And it was a way of telling them we have a common enemy, and that it's the people that basically are us. He was reminding us that reminding them that we have a common enemy. They had a common enemy. I would like to ask you to begin to consider the possibility that we have no enemies on the right. We may agree on social issues, we may disagree, we may agree on some things and disagree on others. We have got to come together and realize what we have in common basically is an interest in economic liberty. That is the core of the other liberties. If we can agree on that, we can wrestle about the other issues offline, but what we've got to do is stop the circular firing squad and take our country back. Then we can have the other debates as we need to. Technique I want to teach you is very simple. Now, it has to be simple, because how many of you have been talking to a liberal and they said something so stupid that you got the blue screen of death? You know what I mean? Your mind just goes blank. You're looking at a blue screen. You can't remember anything you heard on Rush Limbaugh. And their tactics are designed to put you on the defensive and make you get into that state. Basically, it's physiology. When the blood goes to the defensive centers of the brain, it comes from the smart part of your brain. When you're in defensive mode, you don't need to be smart. You just need to be fast, okay? So the blood goes to the defensive centers of your brain. So the technique is simple, and it's actually 3 R's. Recognize the narrative that the liberal wants to follow you. I've told I don't know how many candidates, you don't have to answer the reporter's question. Just because the reporter answers a question, you don't have to answer that question. Because they already know the answer they want you to give. They've already written the headline, and they know what they're going to do with it, okay? So then reframe, literally recrop the picture, as I was talking about earlier, to put the liberal on the defensive. Now this is the tricky step, because some of the techniques here are humorous. You know, some of them are lighthearted, some of them are very hard-hitting. But the humorous ones, you can think, well, wait a minute, that's not going to convince anybody. The reframe step is not, the whole purpose of covering that earlier stuff about us being on the defensive, the purpose of the reframe step isn't to win the argument, it's to put the liberal on the defensive and take the wind out of their sails, okay? So just remember, it doesn't have to be a brilliant comeback, it just has to throw them off their game for a minute. Then you refocus on your narrative. So it's a simple 3-step process. I've got mixed feelings about Chris Christie, but he did handle this one well. Do you remember the video of him when he was at the town hall and the teacher said, "You don't pay me enough"? So recognize, what's the debate she wants to have? Where does she want that to go? Well, we do pay you. No, you don't. I do this. And if you watch that video, she is in his face. She's basically lecturing him, giving him numbers. She's wanting to put him on the defensive. And just for a moment, Christie almost bit. Because he said, now wait a minute, you got to include your benefits. But notice that pattern I talked to you about earlier. You're bad because you don't pay me enough. No, I'm not, because I pay you good benefits. So who's on the defensive?
Yeah.
Chris Christie's on the defensive. Whose narrative is he following? He's following her narrative. In that moment, he caught himself and he said, but you know what? You knew the pay scale going into it and you don't have to do it. Do you remember what the audience did at that point? The audience erupted in cheers because people are sick to death of seeing the left push around our elected politicians. They're sick to death of nobody standing up and speaking the truth. And by the way, what is the new topic now?
Personal responsibility.
The new topic is personal responsibility. And then he said, but let's talk for a minute about the union's tactics. And he then on, now if you were a liberal politician, which would you rather talk about, union tactics or teacher pay? A couple other quick examples. First off, the reframes that we talk about in the book actually range from using humor to asking the right kind of questions, clarifying questions, probing, challenging. Don't have time to get into those tonight, but I just wanted you to see that the steps can actually depend on the situation. If you're talking to your college student, you're probably going to ask more questions and just understand their thinking better so that you can have a dialogue with them. If you're debating a liberal in a debate on television, you probably want to at least once turn their rhetoric against them. I'm giving you an example of that one just for fun. And then there's one we call the inconvenient truth, and that's just when you hit them right between the eyes with the truth that they can't, it's indisputable truth, they can't deny it, and you put them on the defensive. Give you a couple of quick more examples and then we'll break. But how many times have you heard we need to raise the taxes on the rich to balance the budget? I don't know why we do this. I'll hear Republicans say or conservatives say all the time, well, I think we need to consider higher revenue. What do they really mean by that? I don't mind if the government has more revenue. I just don't want them to raise taxes. You know, because we know the answer to that. You can cut tax rates and get more revenue. Why do we let them confuse tax rates and tax revenue? What they want you to say is that taxes are already too high. You're trying to convince somebody who's not paying taxes that taxes are too high. It ain't going to work. What you can do is ask a simple question, but do you want to raise tax rates or tax revenue? Now what am I trying to take them into there?
Economics.
Trying to take them into Economics 101. Because then once they're saying, well, I don't really know, or what's the difference, or whatever their answer is, I'm then in a position to say, well, let's talk about that. That's when we can have that discussion. That's when we can help them realize when you tax productivity, you get less of it. Here's another fun one. I just want to cover a couple quick more to make a couple of points. This one's kind of fun. How many of you run into this one? Guns should be outlawed. Who needs to have a gun? Or somebody asked me the other day, who needs an AR-15? My answer was, who needs a whiny liberal? But there you are. I'm not really that mean. It was all in fun. What they want us to do is tell them about the Second Amendment. Does a hardcore liberal care about the Second Amendment or the First Amendment or any of the other amendments? How about this one? Now, this is using their rhetoric against them. And it's a cold-hearted trick. But if concealed carry laws save just one life, how many times have we heard that one? And we can't ask, if Obamacare saved just one child, would you support it? And there you are saying no. I mean, it makes you say, so why don't we ever turn that one around? But if concealed carry could save just one life, wouldn't it be worth it? And then, when they're standing there with their mouth open, you can say, well, let's talk a little bit about the evidence there. Let's talk a little bit about what happens when you control guns. How many of you ran into this one? That's Sarah Palin's just too radical. How many of you have ever tried to say, I don't think she's radical at all, let's try this one? You know, a lot of people are threatened by strong women. I actually taught that one in a workshop a while back, and I got an email from a lady that said that question actually came up at lunch the next week with a liberal friend of hers who said, I don't think Sarah Palin was qualified to be governor anyway, or be vice president anyway. And the lady said, what the heck? And she tried this one and said, you know, a lot of people are still threatened by strong women. Not only did the liberal go into vapor lock, she said that people at the next table stopped chewing and started which will unfortunately take you very often to have to say, well, you know, does anybody know how to reboot a liberal? Because this one's locked up. Which raises the question, why would you reboot a liberal? One more, this is an example of using the inconvenient truth. This is one we get hit with all the time. I'm kind of a 60s liberal in a lot of ways in terms of a lot of my values. I bought into the civil rights movement early on, and so I take this one personally. It really ticks me off. How many times have you tried to say, no, we're not, just look at the evidence? Well, I wanted Alan West to be president. I mean, how many times have we tried to do that? And we're defending ourselves against an unjust charge when we do that. How about if we do this? If you want to talk about racism, let's look at the damage done to the black families by 70 years of liberal social experimentation, put them on the defensive, and then say, do you even see the damage that you've done? That's either a yes answer or a no answer. And whichever way they go, I'm coming after them on my terms. Because what the left has done to black families in this country borders on criminal. And it's time for us to hold them accountable for that. I always suggest, I like what you were talking about earlier about kind of your talking points, because I always suggest that we have a short list of talking points and have them well rehearsed. Because when a liberal gets in your face, these points are going to go out of your mind. So I recommend that we always have just a few points that we're ready to make about whatever our hot button issues are. Have them ready, have them practiced. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you. You've been very patient.